Shalom, welcome back everyone. Today we're studying Parashat Vayishlach and its wider connection to the underlying theme of Sefer Bereishit. And in Parashat Vayishlach, we find something very interesting when Yaakov returns to the land of Israel after what I'd like to call spending some 20 years in Levin University. When he returns to Beit El, but we have two stories of Yaakov returning to Beit El in chapter 35. In chapter 35, he returns to Beit El almost as a city of refuge, because he's running away from the neighbors of Shechem after what happened in the incident in Shechem with Shimon and Levi, what they did to the city. If we have time, we'll return to that story. But then we have another story of Yaakov returning to Beit El in chapter 35, in another Parsha, in verse 9, which is very different, where he receives a blessing, he gets a name, the name changes from Yaakov to Israel. What I want to try to explain in our short little discussion today is why does Yaakov return twice to Beit El? And what's the difference between those two times that he returns? What's being emphasized in each? And when each one happened? Because they seem to be two totally different events. I want to begin with the second story of Yaakov returning to Beit El in chapter 35, verse 9, Perek Lamed Hey, Pasuk Tet. And I'm going to try to explain later on, but I think this happened first. Let me explain why it must have happened first. Yaakov has been away from home for some 20 years. When he comes back to Israel, it only makes sense that he should come back and see his parents. He should return to Hebron, to Yitzchak in Hebron, and see his parents. It would also make sense he'd return in a manner that Avram first came to Israel. Remember, when Avram first came to Israel, he crossed the Jordan Valley probably, from the Gilad, coming from Mesopotamia. And when you come to the mountain range, you go up what's called Nachal Tirzah, and you go to the area of Shechem, and then you're on Highway 60 from north to south. And the way to travel from Mesopotamia into the mountain range, again, you go through the Jordan Valley and go up the hill to Shechem, between Har Val and Har Gerizim. And then from Shechem, you have a Highway 60 today. You pass Shiloh, you pass Beit El, you pass Yerushalayim, you pass Beit Lechem, and you get to Hebron. And then later you continue going down south to Beersheba. So for Yaakov to return and stop first in Shechem makes sense. To continue to Beit El is on the way, and to continue to Hebron would make sense. And what should be happening, Yaakov Avinu should return with his family from Mesopotamia, cross the Jordan, go up to Shechem, maybe say thank you, stop in Beit El to fulfill his neder possibly, where he had his dream, and then continue on the road to Yitzchak, his father, and meet his family. It wouldn't make sense for Yaakov traveling so far after 20 years to get to Shechem and stay in Shechem and not go back and see his parents. Therefore, what I want to claim is all the events that happened in Shechem with Dinah and Shimon and Levi happened years later. We'll try to prove why that has to be. And for some reason, Chumash inserts that in the middle of the main story. So I want to go from the end of Perek Lamed Gimel, when Yaakov, I'll read the pasuk, Lamed Gimel Yudchet, Vayavo Yaakov Shalem Ir Shechem Asher Be'eretz Canaan Bavo Mi Padan Aram. Yaakov returns from Padan Aram. Remember the phrase Padan Aram? And he sets up camp outside the city, and like any good Jew, he buys real estate. He might want to come back here one day in the future. He buys a Chelkat HaSadeh, where he's going to set up his tent and have a place to return to one day. We'll see, because he has a lot of cattle from the local population. He builds a mizbech and calls it thanking the God of Israel who brought him back. It makes sense. He comes to Shechem. He's not ready to make a house for God yet. No one knows him yet. But he's going to say thank you to God. He returned to Shechem and does almost the same thing Avraham Avinu did in Shechem. He built a mizbech, and God gives him the promise of you're going to be a nation, and God has fulfilled the first promise in his revelation back in Parashat Vayetze, B'shabti b'shalom beit avi, I'll bring you back in peace to your father's land. Now, I want to claim that the story of Dinah happened years later. We'll explain why. Actually, I'll explain right now. If you look at the ages of the children, when Yaakov returns, Yaakov was by Lavan for 20 years, but didn't have children until after 7 years. Actually, the first child was born after 8 years, because he only gets married after 7 years of work. Therefore, The oldest Reuven could be is 12 when he returns, 12, maybe 13. And then Shimon is 11, Levi maybe 10. And Dinah, the youngest daughter, can be more than 2 or 3 years old. It simply doesn't make sense that the story of Dinah being taken in Shechem and Shimon and Levi coming to rescue her is a story about a 3-year-old being raped and her 10 and 12-year not even bar mitzvah boys coming in, wiping out the city. It makes more sense the story happened 5-10 years later, which would fit in, would make the story a lot more, much more logical. You know, the boys are already teenagers. They're 19, 20, 21, and Dinah would be 12 or 13. But why Chumash inserts the story in Perek Lamed Daled? Once we mention Shechem, we just tell the story of what happened in Shechem. So what I claim is the entire Shechem incident happens some 10 years later. Again, I'll give another reason later on why it's inserted at this point. Therefore, I want to claim is that after Yaakov goes to Shechem and buys land, he continues traveling to go visit his parents. So it makes sense he would do such a thing. And on his way there, he stops in Beitel. And therefore, I have to read from the end of Perek Lamed Gimel. Chronologically, I have to go to Perek Lamed Hey, Pasuk Tet. Now that he's returned, he should stop in Beitel where he made his neder, where he made his promise. So let's read. Pasuk Tet. Vayera Elohim el Yaakov od bavo mi Padan Aram. Notice the word Padan Aram as opposed to Haran. If we go back to the end of Lamed Gimel. Vayavo Yaakov Shalem ir Shechem asher betzkan bavo mi Padan Aram. When he came back from Padan Aram, and then he buys the field. And then God appeared to Yaakov when he came back from Padan Aram and blessed him. And what does God tell him? V'yomer Elohim Shimcha Yaakov lo yikra Shimcha od Yaakov ki misah yeshmecha v'yikra shmo Yisrael. God now, b'shem Elokim, changes Yaakov's name to Yisrael. He's going to sort of finalize that name change he received from the Malach on his journey here. Now it becomes official. And then we're going to have a very important phrase. V'yomer Elohim Ani El Shaddai Prei Urvei Kal Goim Yem Mimeka Umalachim Becharetzecha Yetzeo. Elohim tells Yaakov, I am God, my name is El Shaddai, be fruitful, multiply, you're going to be a great nation, there'll be leadership and kings coming from you, you'll have sovereignty, etc. You'll be a great nation. Okay? Now you're going to get the land I promised Avram and Yitzchak, your parents and grandparents, and for your offspring afterwards, and then God left him. Now there's only 2 times in Chumash where God says, Ani El Shaddai. As you probably remember, in chapter 17, at the introduction to Brit Milah, right before God changes Avram's name to Abraham and begins the filtering process in choosing which family is going to be the chosen family, the filtering process where God picks Abraham and his wife Sarah to give birth to Yitzchak, and hence Yitzchak, which continues in chapter 17, and the blessing of Purvu and Brit Milah, all given b'shem Elokim, what we call the circumcision covenant. We have all the exact same wording here. The only 2 times is in Brit Milah, and now when Yaakov returns from Beitel, when his name changes from Yaakov to Israel. What I want to claim is the name of God, which relates to fertility and having children, but only a specific child being chosen, that filtering process of Sefer Bereishit always connects to God's name El Shaddai. And it's unique again in Sefer Bereishit in these 2 cases. That's why when Yitzchak is sending Yaakov to get a wife, back in Parashat Toldot, at the end of Parashat Toldot, he's not deciding he's chosen, but he's blessing Yaakov that El Shaddai Yivrechotcha, the God who named me, Yitzchak, right, and who chose me over Yishmael, and the God who's going to decide whether Yaakov or Esav will be chosen, he should bless you and give you the blessing of Abraham. And indeed, it's finally fulfilled. Yitzchak's blessing that El Shaddai should bless Yaakov is finally fulfilled when Yaakov returns after God has fulfilled his promise to Yaakov in his dream in the beginning of Parashat Vayetze, back in Beitel. So now it's official. It only makes sense that all this happens immediately upon Yaakov's return to Beitel. It doesn't make sense that this is happening after the whole Shechem incident some 10, 15 years later. Rather, if I follow chronologically, Yaakov returns with his family to first to Shechem, and then continues to Beitel. In Beitel, God appears to him makes the official name change from Yaakov to Yisrael, ending the Bechira process. Now Yaakov and all of his children are going to be chosen. Repeats the blessing from Avram Avinu, and again promising the land. And then Yaakov marks the spot again, because God appeared to him like he did last time. Yaakov takes the matzeva just like he did in his dream in Beitel on leaving Israel. He puts up a matzeva again and puts oil on it, and therefore the site has to be Beitel. Vayikra Yaakov et Shem HaMakom Asher Diber Hashem Elohim Beitel. He calls the name again the city Beitel. He's not naming the city, he's naming the site as the ideal place to build a house for God. He's going to reaffirm his letter. He can't build a house for God yet. He's still young. He hasn't established himself yet in the land. But he's going to reassert his goal to build a house for God as soon as things settle down and he has a family and people look up to him. And then he continues from Beitel to go visit his father, Vaisumi Beitel, and they're on the way to Ephrata, which is right before Hebron, south of there of Yerushalayim. He's continuing to travel, but it's still a long distance. And unfortunately, Rachel dies on the road, and that's when things start to fall apart. Rachel dies, she gives birth to Binyamin, and that pretty much ends the story of Yaakov, because afterwards he puts up a matzeva where we call Kever Rachel on that spot. Then we have that interesting story about Reuven sleeping with Bilhah, and what happened. We'll skip that for now, but we're going to say, despite all that, all the children are chosen. And then we end the story of Yaakov with his 12 sons that are all chosen, and the birth of Yitzchak, and the death of Yitzchak. But the only time we find out that Yaakov came back is in Pasuk Chav Zayin in the end of Perek Lamed Hey, in the concluding verses, V'yavo Yaakov el Yitzchak aviv, mamrei Kiryat Arba hi Hebron, asher gasham Avram b'Yitzchak. Then Vayim Yitzchak mat shana v'shmanim shana, Vayikva Yitzchak v'yamot v'yasaf el amav, zaken u'sfa yamim, v'yikbroto Esav Yaakov b'nav. And that's the end of the Yaakov stories. Now, it's simply not possible that Yaakov doesn't come back to visit his father until the day before he dies. In other words, these verses at the end are summary verses, but we're having a flashback. Oh, by the way, Yaakov had returned to Yitzchak in Kiryat Arba, in Elonei Mamre, where he was living. I'm saying that must have happened when he first came back. It only makes sense after 20 years he'd come back and say hi to his parents. And a couple years later, his children are going to take the sheep and watch the sheep in Shechem, or maybe together with their father, we'll see. But the family moves after several years, going back to Shechem where he bought real estate, and then the story of Dinah happens. So that's the background. That's explaining the chronology. Now I want to give it a reason, a possible reason, why the story of Dinah and Shechem is placed in between. Because of its basically tragic ending. What happened? What should have happened? Yaakov should have returned with his family in peace and began the nation. In many ways, I could view Yaakov's 20 years by Lavan as a mini fulfillment of Brit Ben Abtarim. Why? The fourth generation is returned, V'dor Revi Ashuv Hena, because from Avram till Yaakov's children is fourth generation. He was in someone else's land. Remember? Im Lavan Garti. Remember? Yodoti Daki Geri Azarcha, your offspring. Could be referring to Yaakov. Remember, not happening in Avram's lifetime. Yaakov is going to be a stranger in someone else's land. V'abdu v'nuotam. Yaakov himself says that's what Lavan did to him. He was oppressed. He leaves Lavan with great wealth. The famous chase scene, the 7-day chase, very similar to, and with the 3-day distance, very similar to what happens later in Yitzhak Mitzrayim. But in the micro, Yaakov by Lavan, living in exile, being oppressed, and being saved by God, and leaving with great wealth, and then returning to land, in theory, Brit Ben Abtarim could have been fulfilled in the story of Yaakov with Lavan. In fact, in our Agada, remember, we start Arami Aved, we relate that already to Lavan in a certain way. So what went wrong? It could be that the beginning of the fall was what happened in Shechem. Because the brothers go to Shechem, the whole family goes to Shechem later on. Again, we assume it's some 5-10 years later. And then what happens? The incident in Shechem where it's not good what happened. Now, of course, the brothers have to save Dinah, their sister. Does that give them the right to wipe out the entire city of Shechem? That's a good question. That's an argument between Shimon and Levi and Yaakov. Yaakov thinks what they did was disastrous. Of course, you can do a surgical raid and save your sister, But to wipe out the whole city of Shechem and take all their cattle, etc., as Yaakov says, what's going to happen? The whole nation, everyone around us is going to hate us. And of course, they answer back, we have to show them who's boss in the Middle East. We're not going to let them treat our daughter like a zonah. So again, there's a beautiful argument, actually almost a sad argument between Yaakov and his children. Each side, again, being sure they're right. But bottom line, the whole family now is in danger, as Yaakov says, because all the nations around them are going to come and try and kill them in retaliation for what they did to the city of Shechem. Who saves him? God tells Yaakov, return to Beitel and build a mizbech to who? If I now go back to the beginning of Perek Lamed Hey, and we'll end with this, Elohim comes to Yaakov after that incident in Shechem and tells him, go to Beitel, stay there and make a mizbech to the God who saved you the last time. Instead of Yaakov returning to Beitel and building a house for God and making God's name great, unfortunately, and most tragically, Beitel becomes a house of refuge, almost an irmiklat for his family. And then Yaakov has to tell his family, get rid of all the idol worship that you probably took when you captured Shechem. They probably had idol worship with them and took things they shouldn't have taken. Get rid of all that. Okay? And they take all these Elohei Nechar and bury them under the Elah tree in Shechem. And then we're told, Vaysu vayhi chitat olim al harim asher svivotehem. Then God's fear was over all the nations that surrounded the city of Shechem. So God saves Yaakov and his family from the nations retaliating. And then Yaakov goes to Luzah, which is in the land of Canaan, which later becomes Beitel, all the people with him. He builds a mizbeach, and what's he called the mizbeach? Beitel, instead of becoming a place to make a name for God and spreading his name out, becomes a city of refuge. The same God who saved me when I ran away from Esav, he's the God who's saving me now from the people in the neighboring cities of Shechem. So that's the tragic ending. And unfortunately, in Yaakov's life, Yaakov would have loved to build a house for God. That was his goal. But his children, again, they were sure they're doing the right thing, what they did to Shechem. But the tragic situation was, after what happened in Shechem, no one looks up to you. The neighboring population hates you. Your dream of building a house for God has to be put on a back burner. Yaakov is going to repeat his neder to make a house for God in Shechem. He can't fulfill it because of the events of Shechem. And tragically, he has to wait. Then Yosef is sold by his brothers. And then unfortunately, we have to go through another wave of Brit Ben Abtarim. We have to go through exile in Egypt. It's going to take some 400 years now till we come back. And the rest, we know, is in our Jewish history. But the two returns to Shechem, one is ideal, the Bechira process being finished, Yaakov stating his goals. Beautifully, the Bechira process is over, all of his children are chosen. He gets his name changed, he graduated Lebanon University, he passed his test defeating the Malach. He can be a fighter, not only in Ishtam, but he can also be Yisrael, he can fight. He can have that dual identity, the Kol of Yaakov and the Adam of Esav. But tragically, because of the way his children are acting, even though they meant well, the results were disastrous, and Yaakov's dream now becomes only a dream to build a house for God, and will only be fulfilled hundreds of years later by, not to the time of David HaMelech, when he wants to build a house for God, to make God's name great, as you can read in the book of Divrei Yamim, and later in Sefer Shmuel as well, in the book of Malachim. Everyone should have a wonderful week, and Mir Hashem, our generation should be able to get the stage ready for maybe the next generation building a house for God. Everyone have Shabbat Shalom.